Like all wars, the War of 1812 demonstrated the devastating toll that conflict can take on nations and individuals, costing people their homes, properties, and sometimes their lives. Historians often call this conflict the War of Miscommunications because of the several examples of the failure or slow speed of communications at the time. However, the most important failure of communication in this event was not only the challenges of relaying messages across the ocean in the early 19th century, but also a deeper failure of understanding between nations and the lack of will of both countries to reach a peaceful solution. The War of 1812, as you will see, was a perfect example of this happening. In the early 19th century, Great Britain began imposing what many Americans thought were unjustified laws such as the Orders in Council. This largely prohibited trade between the US and France. As a result, many US merchants began falling into poverty because many depended on the naval trading between merchants in France. This was the first event that catapulted both the US and Great Britain into what many people now know as the War of Miscommunications or the War of 1812. To add to the anger of the American people, it wasn't uncommon for British vessels to practice what is known as impressment, which was the capturing of U.S. merchant ships and forcing the crew to act as slaves to the British ship. In the summer of 1807, an American naval ship known as the Chesapeake was fired upon by a British warship because some of the crew of the Chesapeake had been deserters from the British Navy. This resulted in the capturing of 4 of the deserters. The press at the time covered the incident extensively in the coming months, making it more well known than ever. After the incident, many Americans called for war, having had enough of British impressment and abuse, as more incidents, not unlike the Chesapeake, continued to occur. Many historians today credit the Chesapeake incident as one of the main reasons that America went to war with Great Britain. With Thomas Jefferson being the current president, he proposed the Embargo Act in December of that year, which completely cut off all international trade as it was a way to get back for Britain, not allowing them to trade with France. This was later replaced by a less radical Non-Intercourse Act, which made it so that it was only prohibited to trade with Great Britain. With the two main political parties being the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans at the time, the Federalists opposed going to war with Britain. They, rightfully so, thought the young United States just couldn't handle another war with Britain at the time. This was a continued topic of debate between the two parties, with the Federalists holding back the angered Democratic Republicans. In the summer months of 1812, however, delegates in Congress put enough pressure on James Madison to sign a declaration of war on Britain. On June 18, 1812, the United States had officially begun its second war with Great Britain.
During the War of 1812, communication was very poor. The United States did something that Great Britain didn't like, such as sinking one of their ships. Then it would take weeks to provide an explanation. Although it was slow, communicating was still possible. Some examples of communication that worked were when the United States sent a letter to Great Britain, essentially complaining to them about impressment. In turn, because good communication was not used, lives were harmed. For example, ships were taken and the United States could have prevented them from being taken. Great Britain would take ships and make it a British merchant ship. All the crew would be made into British merchants. This was a major issue because the American economy was suffering, so the British economy would be boosted. There was very little effort put into communication. If effort was put into trying to communicate, then there would have been more peaceful interactions between the two countries. However, that's not where the bad communication stops. As the hunger for Western expansion continued, some people like warhawks planned to take over Canada. Although the warhawks in Congress had intent to take over the British land of Canada, the agenda for Congress wasn't public. This shows how bad the communication was. There were many different groups trying to get their way during the war. This made communication very hard because no one really knew what the country wanted. All of the governments of the war had to make different assumptions about different governments' plans. This led to many different encounters on the northern front that could have been avoided. The American and British troops both communicated in battle. They would yell, deliver letters, and use drummers to communicate with troops in battles. If good communication was not used, lives would be lost. For example, during the impressment issue, Americans tried to communicate with Great Britain, but after Great Britain wouldn't budge, they just gave up. If they tried to keep going, they may have had better luck with Great Britain working with them. This may have stopped impressment.
This war left a large impact in both countries. Their economies got worse, their casualties were high, and both sides' naval power shrunk as a result of the war. The United States already had a fair amount of debt from the Revolutionary War, so the war only made things worse. The economies recovered fairly quickly considering the overall toll the war took on the countries. All the prisoners were let go as soon as the war ended. The naval force was weakened by both sides. The British, before the war, had about 130 ships, but after the war they only had a few dozen. The casualties of both sides were around 15,000 for the United States and only 8,600 for Britain. On December 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the war. The British Army was unaware that, and they arranged an attack on New Orleans. The battle continued until the United States, led by Andrew Jackson, soundly defeated the British forces. One of the biggest long-term impacts of the war is the fact that all British soldiers would be removed from the United States land. Without the war, the United States would likely look very different. It would likely not have states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. This whole war could have been avoided by communicating with the other side, but because of miscommunication, there were casualties and devastation in both countries. The Treaty of Ghent was considered the ending of the war. It forced British troops to be removed from their area, opening the Great Lakes up to the United States for westward expansion. But because America had managed to fight the world's greatest military power to a virtual standstill, it gained international respect. It gave a greater sense of nationalism among its citizens. While the War of 1812 had virtually no impact in England, it did assure the survival of both the British colonies in Canada and ultimately paved the way for the Canadian Confederation. Some historians believe that the War of 1812 had not happened, Canada would have become part of the United States because so many Americans would have migrated north. Overall, this war was known as the War of Miscommunication because of how much it would have changed the outcome of the war if they could have talked it out and made an agreement. Thank you for listening to this documentary.